Uh, Welcome to the module on non-conventional trademarks and domain name. Firstly, we will discuss non-conventional trademarks like olfactory marks, sound marks, color marks, shape marks, and then we will discuss about domain name and trademark protection. Uh, to begin with non-conventional trademarks, there are many non-conventional trademarks, but today's presentation will focus on 4 specific ones, which are olfactory marks, sound marks, color marks, shape marks. The key requirements before we begin to understand the various trademarks is non-conventional marks is the key requirement to register a trademark is that it has to be distinctive, that the mark has to be distinctive, and it should be capable of graphical representation. Now, a non-conventional trademark could be distinctive in character. The problem that a non-conventional trademark actually runs into is usually with regard to graphical representation. Let's look at why we have graphical representation. Graphical representation of the sign usually enables people to know precisely what mark is actually protected, right? The entry of the mark in the public register has the aim of actually making it accessible to authorities and the public. It also avoids any element of subjectivity in the process of identifying the sign. Now, let's look at smell marks as such. Common types of smell marks that have been attempted to be trademarked are smell of rose for tires, smell of freshly cut grass for tennis balls, cinnamon flavored furniture, etc. Now, the important thing to keep in mind is whether the smell is an inherent attribute or natural characteristic of the goods, whether the smell added by the applicant is to identify the goods. Will the public regard the smell as a sign which identifies the applicant's goods? Is the mark capable of being represented graphically? A very important and vital case dealing with smell marks is the case decided by the European Court of Justice, which is called as Ralph Seichmann versus Deutsche Patent and Trademark Office. Now, in this particular case, a protection was sought for the olfactory mark in the Dutch Trademark Office. Now, what was actually sought to be protected was basically a pure chemical substance called methyl cinnamate, whose structural formula is set out as C6H5CH is equal to CHCOOCH3. Basically, they claim for the pure chemical substance methyl cinnamate and also claim for the structural formula of the chemical substance as such. Samples of this olfactory mark were also provided to the trademark office, and it was also listed in the application that it could actually be obtained in various laboratories. Now, odor sample submitted along with the application was described as balsamically fruity with a slight hint of cinnamon. Now, question was whether this can get a trademark. When an odor is reproduced by a chemical formula, can a chemical formula be trademarked? When an odor is represented by a description, can that description be trademarked? When it is deposited, can that be trademarked? Or will a trademark be granted to a combination of above? And further question that was actually raised in this matter was whether such olfactory marks could be graphically represented. Now, courts obviously focused on the issue of graphical representation. Now, the court said trademark acted as a source identifier. Now, as a source identifier, it enabled people to actually avoid any confusion in distinguishing the products and services of one trader from that of the other. Only signs which are actually capable of being perceived visually, that is, which are actually written in terms of letters or in terms of characters or by a picture can be regarded as graphically represented. Now the big question is, can olfactory marks be graphically represented? The answer seems to be no. Now the court discussion went to the extent that the court said olfactory marks are actually inaccessible, it's not clear and precise, it is not self-contained, it is not easily accessible and intelligible, and moreover it is not durable. The reason for this is the court laid out that accessibility, clarity, precision, self-containment, intelligibility and durability are the key requirements when you look at graphical representation. So the court concluded the object of representation is specifically, graphical representation is to avoid any element of subjectivity in the process of identifying and perceiving the sign. Consequently, the means of graphical representation must be unequivocal and objective. In the light of the foregoing observations, answer to the question must be that a trademark may consist of a sign which is not in itself capable of being perceived visually, provided that it can be represented graphically, particularly by means of images, lines, or characters. Court here seems to kind of very clearly lay out that to be graphically represented, it must be possible to kind of represent it in the form of images, lines, or characters. And further, it said it must be clear, precise, self-contained, easily accessible, intelligible, durable, and objective. Now, in the instance of methyl cyanamide being represented in the form of characters, that is, in terms of written words, it does not clearly represent what the odor smells like. Further, with the chemical formula, very few people who are trained in chemistry, organic chemistry, can actually recognize what that formula stands for, and as such, it was not sufficient and clear and precise. Subsequently, it was also clear that any form of submission of the sample in laboratories or in the form of a deposit to the trademark office would not suffice, for the simple reason that samples over a period of time, when get exposed to the nature, the odor smell could obviously change, and as such it may not be easily discernible as to what the original sample was and subsequently what it is, right? As a result, the court ruled that balsamically fruity with a slight hint of cinnamon was not clear, precise, or objective, but was accessible and intelligible. It said the structural formula was objective, but was not intelligible to ordinarily lay persons who would require assistance from external agencies or persons, and as such was not self-contained. Now, what is the current status with respect to olfactory marks? The current status is it appears to be absolutely difficult for anyone who wants to get an olfactory mark to satisfy the 7 criteria which was laid out in the Sykman case. What exactly are those criteria? That a mark needs to be clear, precise, self-contained, easily accessible, intelligible, durable, and objective. As most olfactory marks do not meet these requirements, it might actually be difficult to represent it as being capable of graphically being represented. Secondly, we will discuss about color marks. Now, what is the problem with color marks? The biggest problem with color marks is usually the shade confusion. There are different shades of the same color. How do public actually identify with different shades of colors? Would they actually treat it as a mark in itself? The other concern with using colors as trademarks is the possibility of color depletion. That is, if a monopoly is granted to owner of a particular color, then no other person can actually use the color. This basically kind of means that there's likely to be very limited number of colors that is available for traders to be used on their goods as such. An important case in this regard is Libertel Group versus Benelux. This was an application meant to register the color orange. The court held that single color marks are actually capable of constituting a sign and are eligible for trademark protection if they can distinguish goods of one undertaking from those of another and can be defined in a sufficiently clear way. To be acceptable, graphical representation of the color must be clear, precise, self-contained, easily accessible, intelligible, durable, and objective. Basically, the court reiterated the Sykman criteria as discussed in the Sykman case. This condition may be satisfied by designating that the color using an internationally recognized identification code such as Pantone is a precise and stable form of verbal description of the color. So basically, when you're actually claiming a color mark, it not only needs to meet the Sykman criteria, but the color needs to be clearly identifiable in terms of an recognized international code. Right? So while considering the registration of the color per se as trademark, private interest of a single trader has to be weighed against the public interest of not unduly restricting the availability of colors for all traders. The other requirement is that of distinctiveness, that the color over a period of time should have achieved distinctiveness, right? That is basically the customer can identify a particular color to basically mean a particular product. Now we come to the discussion on sound marks. Specify pitch and duration of sound, that is largely when they are represented on staves. Then you have possible form of actually electronic application of a sound file, right? So these are the various modes in which you can actually represent sound. But the question really is, are sounds capable of being registered? The answer to this was given by the courts in Shieldmark versus Joostgist. Shieldmark actually held 14 trademarks, and some of the trademarks were related to musical stave, which contained the first 9 notes of the musical composition of Für Elise by Ludwig van Beethoven. 2 of these sound marks consisted of representations of the melody formed by the notes, that is graphically transcribed on the stave, plus in one case played on a piano. There were further marks which consisted of sequence of musical notes like E, D hash, E, D hash, etc. These were basically not put on a musical stave, but they were largely kind of symbols that are used to represent certain notes. There were further marks largely which were in the form of sequence of notes as such played on a piano. Now the question was someone else used similar kind of sound on their computer, which kind of included the onomatopoeia kukluku, which was protected by Shield's trademark, and also used Für Elise's notes when the computer was started. So Shield actually brought an infringement action against the defendant. So when the matter came up before the German courts, it was clearly a matter of great concern for the German courts, and the German courts actually kind of referred the matter to the European Court of Justice, seeking to know whether musical notes, whether written description in the form of onomatopoeia, whether written description in some other form, whether graphical representation of sonograms could actually be treated as graphical representation of sounds and whether sound marks can be trademarked. Now, the ECJ very clearly said in this particular instance, as long as the music is represented on a musical stave that clearly indicates the pitch and the frequency of the sound, then such a representation could be treated as a graphical representation because it meets all the criteria specified in the Reichmann case and as such capable of being represented graphically. But any other form like representation of music merely in terms of notes or symbols or in the form of word description of onomatopoeia like kukluku cannot be treated as capable of being graphically represented for the simple reason that there is an element of subjectivity involved in it and that it does not necessarily meet the Reichmann criteria. So, as far as sound marks are concerned, it is important to keep in mind that one needs to very clearly specify in their application for a sound mark that you are claiming a sound mark. 2, you are clearly kind of using a musical stave and the musical notes to clearly represent the frequency and pitch. Only in such an instance would a sound mark be granted. But the courts in other cases have also kind of said the graphical representation of sounds in the form of a sonogram, which clearly indicates the timing, the frequency, the change in the pitch, can also be granted a trademark for the simple reason that it is an objective representation of the sound and there is likely to be no subjectivity. Further, we move on to shape marks. Are shapes being capable of being granted trademark as such? This was a matter of great contention in the case called Philips versus Remington. Now, the Dutch company Philips came up with an electric razor in 1937. 2 years later, they introduced their first model to market, a single-headed rotary shaver. This was followed by a two-headed rotary shaver and in 1966 by a three-headed product in which the heads were arranged in a triangular pattern which projected slightly above a triangular base plate. The three-headed model was sold under the trademark Philly Shave and soon became highly successful, accounting for about 30% of the world's electric shaver market. In the UK, Philips' annual sales of Philly Shave razors had reached about 2 million by 1989, and although this had fallen significantly to about 400,000 by 1996, they were still one of the major players in the market. But in 1985, in order to reinforce their monopoly, Philips registered a trademark consisting of a picture of three-headed razor in the United Kingdom. In spite of this, Philips' monopoly was finally challenged in 1995 when Remington introduced their own three-headed electric shaver. Not surprisingly, Philips sued Remington for trademark infringement, and in response, Remington sought to invalidate trademark on various grounds. In responding to the claim of the trademark infringement, Remington contended that the trademark registrations relied upon by Philips do not confer exclusive rights to use the trademark as a design for the faceplate of the shavers. Furthermore, Remington contended that it had not used the design as a trademark. So, in this particular case, the court said if a particular shape is taken to serve an essential function, right? That is, if the shape attained is to perform a particular technical function, in such an instance, the shape cannot be granted a trademark. The court said the ground for refusal or invalidity of registration imposed by the provision cannot be overcome by establishing that there are other shapes which allow the same technical result to be obtained. In order to be capable of distinguishing the shape of the article in respect of which the sign is registered does not require any addition such as an embellishment which has no functional purpose. Extensive use of a sign which consists of the shape of these goods may be sufficient to give the sign a distinctive character. So the court in essence here said that if you're registering the shape for a shape mark, one has to prove that it is capable of being represented graphically. It's capable of distinguishing goods of one trader from those of another trader. It is not devoid of any distinctive character, or if it has acquired a distinctive character through the use that has been made of it. Further, it does not consist exclusively of the shape which results from the nature of the goods themselves. That is one criteria wherein the shape should not have been from the natural form that the good actually takes. Second, shape mark will not be granted if the shape attained is largely to obtain a technical result. Further, the court said shape mark will not be granted if the shape attained is meant to give a substantial value to the good. Right? So this was largely the crux of the case in Phillips versus Remington, where the court said the shape attained by Phillips, that is the triangular shape with raised blades, was largely to perform a technical function. If it performs an essential technical function, then the shape will definitely not be granted protection under trademark as such. The other case that is of importance is the Lego Bricks versus Mega Brands. Now, in 1996, Lego Brands applied to register the red Lego brick as a three-dimensional mark for games and playthings. Now, the trademark office refused the application on the ground that the toy brick shape was devoid of any distinctive character. Second, the sign consisted exclusively of the shape of goods which was necessary to obtain a technical result. However, it was later approved. Following the mark's registration, Mega Brands Incorporation applied for a declaration that trademark was invalid. So the relationship between the court basically in this particular instance took into account whether the shape attained by the Lego bricks resulted in some kind of a technical function, and it was found by the court that the shape attained by the brick was largely performing a technical function which can actually be protected under a different intellectual property regime and not under the trademark regime as such. So if you look at the trends in Phillips versus Remington, Lego versus Mega Brands, it is very clear. If a shape is performing a technical function, it will not be granted trademark protection. If a shape is actually taking a natural shape of the good, then it will not be granted a shape mark. Further, if the shape is largely providing some kind of a substantial value to the goods, then that will also not be granted a shape mark as such. So with that, we actually conclude the discussion on non-conventional trademark. Now we come to the discussion on domain name. What exactly is a domain name? I'm sure most of you would actually kind of use and surf internet, and I'm sure one of the ways of actually going to a particular website is to actually type its address. Now this is usually called as the domain name system, right? So a domain name system has a numerical number which is usually called as the internet protocol number, which is usually the numeric address. And then there is also a human readable address, which is like, for instance, if we type in www.gov.in, that is usually a website where human beings can actually kind of type in numerical letters to enter a particular website. Now, who registers these domain names? It is usually done by a non-profit organization called the Internet Corporation for Assigned Names and Numbers. Now, in a number of countries, the agents of ICANN are actually present, and you can actually register your website with them. Now, when registering the websites, the ICANN actually doesn't run in whether a person who's registering the website as a legitimate business connected with the address. They are only concerned with registering the domain name. They're not considering whether a person has a legitimate business or not. So in case there is a dispute wherein two people are claiming a particular website address, then you can either go through the traditional litigation form, that is, in your own country you can start a litigation that you have a claim for a particular domain name, or you can go through the private arbitration provided under the Uniform Domain Name Dispute Resolution Policy, which the ICANN actually provides for. While domain names, it is important to keep in mind, domain names are universal registrations, but trademark protection is largely territorial. So one of the major problems with domain name registrations is the fact that there are a number of people who have obtained domain names of important companies, say for instance Marks and Spencer, Coca-Cola, Sifi, Rediff, etc. While they don't necessarily own a legitimate business, they do not run anything related to those companies, they have registered the domain name, and the whole reason for registering the domain name is largely to kind of then sell it off to the original company which would ideally want that website. So cyber squatting has become a phenomenon as of now, wherein a person who doesn't own a particular business actually ends up registering the domain name in the name of a very well-known mark. For instance, taking the domain name for Marks and Spencer. And the whole idea of cyber squatters is that they are first to register the domain name, and when the company wants to register the domain name, they figure out that there is already someone who has registered the domain name. So cyber squatters would then kind of sell off the domain name to the original business at a very higher rate, right? So one of the important cases in this particular matter is Marks and Spencer's versus 1 in a million. Now this was a case where the person who had registered the domain name had absolutely no interest in the business or legitimate business connected with the domain name. The domain name registers was largely Marks and Spencer's, but they didn't actually own the domain name. The whole idea of registering was basically to ask for more money from Marks and Spencer when Marks and Spencer was ready to register a domain name. So in this particular instance, the court said that there is enough evidence for the plaintiff to show that the defendant intended to infringe the plaintiff's rights in future by registering the domain name in their name, although they did not run any legitimate business. The court here particularly said domain names largely domain name disputes can largely be resolved through disputes of trademark injunction and passing off. The court said use of a trademark in the course of the business of a professional dealer for the purpose of making domain names more valuable and extracting money from the trademark owner basically amounted to use in the course of trade. The very fact that the defendant registered the domain name Marks and Spencer without being legitimately connected with the business, and the fact that they aim to sell the domain name at a higher rate to Marks and Spencer goes to show that the registration was in bad faith. And in all such instances, the plaintiff can readily demonstrate that there was bad faith on the part of defendant when the domain name was registered, and as such, in all such matters, the court would give instant relief to the plaintiff as such. Even in India, the domain names are treated very much like trademarks. There are cases like the Satyam Infoway versus Sifinet Solution, Yahoo versus Akash Chopra, wherein domain names were registered and the defendant largely intended to actually eat into the goodwill of the plaintiff, and as such the courts very clearly kind of mentioned that these are instances where domain names are being registered in bad faith, and as such passing off action was allowed. So in effect, in today's time, although domain name may not necessarily be a trademark, courts are readily intervening to treat domain names as if that they are trademarks. So with this, we actually conclude the module on non-conventional trademarks and domain name. We discussed shape marks, color marks, sound marks, and olfactory marks with respect to non-conventional trademarks, and with respect to domain names, we largely kind of discussed how domain names today have become more or less like trademarks, and courts seem to readily grant injunction and intervene when passing off or infringement actions are brought when there is cyber squatting as such. Thank you very much.